Speed and Nguyen's Deep Dive podcast is an official podcast made by Speed and Nguyen with a voice made from Google's Notebook LM. Do not reproduce our podcast without permissions from the owner. Welcome to the Speed and Nguyen's Deep Dive podcast. So imagine waking up, checking your daily horoscope to see how your week is going to go, and it reads, if you travel today, you will be in debt forever and bring bad luck to your family.
Which is, a pretty intense way to start a Tuesday.
Right. Like, believe it or not, this wasn't just a typo by some eccentric astrologer. It was actually a calculated psychological weapon deployed by a modern government.
Yeah.
Just to stop people from crossing its borders. So today we're taking you on this massive journey into the complex, honestly, pretty surreal machinery of global border management.
It is a deeply layered topic, for sure. We're looking specifically at the policies and messaging strategies of Australia and the United States, and we're utilizing a pretty vast stack of materials here.
Yeah, we've got everything from academic theses and human rights reports to, official government financial updates.
Exactly. And our mission today is to really help you understand the mechanics of how nations attempt to physically and psychologically deter migration. We want to, pull back the curtain a bit, uncover this vast gap between what these border policies claim to do on paper and what the empirical data shows they actually achieve in reality.
Right. But before we really get moving, just a quick note for you listening. Border control, human rights, immigration, these are incredibly charged topics globally.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So our goal today isn't to take a left-wing or a right-wing stance or, to endorse any specific political policy. We are just here to act as your guides through the data and the original materials. We're looking strictly impartially at the mechanics of how these systems work.
Right, just the narratives they create and the statistics behind them. That's a crucial framework for this deep dive. Because to truly understand modern border control, we kind of have to start by looking at what happens when a nation attempts to stretch its jurisdiction outward.
Outward, like past the actual border.
Yeah, exactly. Instead of waiting for people to arrive at a physical border on land, countries like Australia have tried to push their borders deep into the ocean.
Okay, so that brings us to Australia's Operation Sovereign Borders, or OSB, as they call it in the sources. The core concept here seems to be interception, right? Catching unauthorized maritime arrivals long before they can even, see the mainland. But how does a government physically enforce an invisible line in the middle of the sea?
Well, they rely on a heavily militarized maritime presence to execute two main tactics. So the first is what they call turnbacks.
Turnbacks, okay.
Yeah, where military vessels physically intercept migrant boats and force them sometimes literally by towing them back into Indonesian waters.
Wow.
And the second tactic is takebacks. This is where authorities intercept people at sea, transfer them to government vessels or aircraft, and then return them directly to their countries of origin, like Sri Lanka or Vietnam.
I mean, I'm trying to wrap my head around the legalities of this. It sounds a bit like treating the ocean as a giant return-to-sender stamp.
Yeah.
But you aren't checking if the package is going to catch fire the moment it lands.
It's a very good way to put it.
How does a country legally justify returning people to a potentially dangerous situation without sitting them down and evaluating their individual asylum claims?
Well, the short answer from the legal analysis we're looking at is that under international law, they generally can't.
Really?
Yeah. There is this absolute bedrock principle in international refugee law, and it's known as non-refoulement.
Okay, let me stop you right there. Non-refoulement. Break that down for someone who doesn't have a law degree.
Yeah.
What does that actually guarantee in practice?
Sure. So it's the ironclad guarantee that a refugee will not be forcibly returned to a country or territory where they face a legitimate threat of persecution, torture, or, a severe deprivation of basic human rights.
Right, okay.
It's basically the fundamental protection for anyone fleeing a dangerous state. But under the OSB interception policies, boats are routinely returned without conducting those rigorous, individualized evaluations.
And the human rights reports we're examining, they detail some terrifying consequences of bypassing those evaluations.
They really do.
There are documented cases where returnees have faced brutal torture immediately upon being handed over to authorities in Sri Lanka.
Yes.
And in other instances, people were met with immediate imprisonment in Vietnam simply for the act of trying to flee. So, if the international community agrees on non-refoulement, how does a domestic policy like this operate out in the open?
It survives by operating in a highly opaque legal gray area. The Australian government has frequently utilized a veil of military secrecy.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they often brush off questions by citing them as on-water matters to avoid parliamentary and public scrutiny. So by treating these interceptions as classified military operations rather than, say, civilian humanitarian issues, they effectively shield the physical mechanic as the pushbacks from legal oversight.
But the physical deterrence doesn't stop at the shoreline, does it? I mean, the materials detail another, arguably more notorious layer to this physical wall, the offshore processing centers.
Yes.
Yeah.
So for those who were not intercepted at sea or, before the current iteration of the turnback policies, the strategy was offshore detention.
Right.
The idea was to take asylum seekers who arrived by boat and forcibly transfer them to detention facilities in remote island nations, specifically the Republic of Nauru and Papua New Guinea's Manus Island.
Okay.
And the stated purpose was to hold them there while their asylum claims were processed, ensuring they basically never set foot on the Australian mainland.
The theory being that if you remove the incentive of reaching the destination country, people will just stop coming. But the medical data and the human rights investigations paint a profoundly disturbing picture of what actually happened inside those facilities. Like, these were not administrative waiting rooms.
No, not at all. They became sites of systemic cruelty. When you dig into the reports from medical organizations like Medicine Sans Frontières, the language they use is shocking.
Yeah, Doctors Without Borders.
Right. They reported treating levels of severe trauma, mental health crises, and just profound psychological suffering that rivaled what their doctors witness in active kinetic war zones.
Oh, wow. And that's not hyperbole. The data from the Kaldor Centre notes that out of the roughly 4,000 people transferred offshore between 2012 and 2014, the human toll included widespread self-harm, medical neglect resulting in preventable deaths, and even murders within the facilities.
Yeah, the conditions were specifically designed to be punishing.
That's incredibly dark.
It is. But the intentional infliction of hardship was kind of the point. However, operating these physical interceptions and maintaining remote island prisons turned out to be incredibly costly.
Right, and highly visible to international human rights observers.
Exactly. And legally precarious. So governments quickly realized that relying solely on a physical wall at the end of a journey is inefficient. They needed to find a way to stop the journey from ever beginning.
Which means building a wall in someone's mind before they even pack their bags.
Yes.
And this transitions us into a wildly fascinating and frankly surreal aspect of this deep dive, the world of public information campaigns, or PICs.
Deterrence through messaging. And the scale of these campaigns, it's difficult to comprehend until you really look at the financials.
Yeah.
We're talking about massive state-sponsored propaganda efforts operating on a global scale.
I know these campaigns are heavily funded, but what kind of number are we actually looking at here?
So to give you an idea of the scope, Australia spent roughly $50 million on a single initiative called the No Way campaign.
50 million.
Yes, 50 million. They took this stark slogan, "You will not make Australia home," translated it into multiple languages, and literally plastered it across 15 different countries.
Wow.
And the United States utilizes the exact same playbook. They've produced extensive campaigns targeting Mexico and Central America with names like Stay Out, Stay Alive, and No Mas Cruces, which translates to No More Crossings.
You know, what stands out when you review the visual language of these campaigns is the intense reliance on fear. The primary trope researchers identify across all these materials is the dangerous landscape.
Oh, absolutely. They employ highly dramatic, almost cinematic imagery to evoke terror. They want the environment itself to seem, completely insurmountable.
We're talking about high-definition videos of stormy, pitch-black seas, boats precariously tipping over, and jagged rocks hiding under the waves.
Right.
But the U.S. campaigns push this even further into the realm of, total fiction. There's a U.S.-sponsored campaign deployed in Honduras that actually funded the creation of a video game.
Yes, the arcade game.
Yeah, it's this arcade-style animation where you play as a young character named Sipatex-1.
Mm-hmm.
And in the game, you have to fight off a literal werewolf-like creature meant to represent a human smuggler or a coyote. Then you have to evade heavily armed cartel members. And if you survive that, the character ends up stranded in the desert.
And how is the desert depicted in this state-sponsored game?
It's completely surreal. The intense heat of the desert is represented by a demonic, scowling sun that just hovers over the character.
Demonic sun.
Yeah, and the sun shoots rays down, slowly depleting the character's health bar until he literally collapses. The screen then cuts to black and reads, Migration is not a game. Your only life is at stake.
It's an incredibly aggressive piece of psychological messaging. But the researchers in the academic thesis we're reviewing, they raise a fundamental critique of this entire strategy.
Which is what?
Well, these campaigns operate on the incredibly flawed assumption that migrants are simply ignorant of the risks, and that a scary enough picture will just convince them to stay home.
So that's the part that really bothers me.
Okay.
If you are a family fleeing gang violence, extortion, or absolute starvation, a scary billboard about a stormy sea or a hot desert isn't exactly breaking news. You know the journey is dangerous, but the danger pushing you from behind is immediate and real. Showing someone a Hollywood-style disaster trailer doesn't address why they are running out of the burning building in the first place.
Right. It completely ignores the root causes of displacement. But the academic analysis takes this critique a step further, and this is where the mechanics of border control get particularly dark.
Oh.
Yeah, these public information campaigns deliberately obscure a vital reality, and that is the state border policies actually create the very dangerous landscapes they are warning the migrants about.
Wait, I need you to explain that connection. How does a government policy create a dangerous desert or a deadly sea? I mean, the geography hasn't changed.
The geography remains the same, yeah, but the enforcement heavily manipulates how humans interact with it. So let's look at the U.S.-Mexico border. When the United States heavily militarizes safe urban border crossings with walls, drones, and intense patrols, it doesn't stop migration. It intentionally funnels the migration routes out of the cities and into the most remote, hostile, and deadly parts of the Sonoran Desert.
Oh, wow.
The state knows those areas are lethal.
I see. And the same logic applies to the maritime routes in Australia. Like, if you heavily patrol the direct, relatively safe shipping lanes, you force desperate people to take much longer, far more treacherous journeys in unseaworthy vessels just to evade detection.
Precisely. The state effectively weaponizes the natural landscape. People die of exposure in the desert or they drown in the sea as a direct result of being funneled into those hazards.
Yeah.
And then the very same state turns around and produces a $50 million billboard campaign warning people about how deadly the desert and the sea naturally are.
That changes how I look at these campaigns entirely. The state acts like the landscape is a natural villain, basically completely erasing their own architectural role in pushing people into those specific death traps. But I guess if you can't put the blame on your own policies, you need a different scapegoat to take the fall for the casualties.
You need a villain. For these psychological walls to work, especially for the domestic audience watching at home, the government needs to cast a very clear, very simple play. They need distinct monsters, and they need distinct victims.
Let's examine the monster first, the smuggler. Across all the materials we reviewed, smugglers are universally depicted as greedy, inherently evil criminals. Sometimes they aren't even depicted as human.
Like the werewolf game.
Yeah. Or there's a Costa Rican graphic novel produced for an anti-migration campaign where the smuggler is literally drawn as a predatory wolf dressed in human clothes, luring innocent animals into the wilderness to be devoured.
It is a highly convenient narrative for law enforcement. If the smuggler is a predatory monster, the state gets to be the heroic protector. But empirical studies, particularly the extensive research by Zhang and colleagues cited in our materials, reveal that this narrative is a manufactured fiction. When researchers actually interview migrants, they find that smugglers are very often respected community members, friends, or even relatives of the migrants.
So they aren't like shadowy cartel bosses. They're often just the guy who runs the local bakery trying to help his neighbors escape a crisis.
Exactly. They are providing a mutual service. And that service only exists because the state has entirely blocked all legal, safe pathways to migrate.
Okay, I think of it like this. Imagine you're trapped in a deadly, scorching desert, and you desperately need water. The government has boarded up all the public wells and made it illegal to use them.
Right.
So you have to buy water from a guy running an underground, unregulated store. It might be expensive, it might be risky, but it's literally your only option. And then the government runs an ad campaign telling you not to buy water from that store because the owner is greedy, but they still refuse to open the public wells. The black market only exists because the legal routes were deliberately closed.
That captures the dynamic perfectly. The market for smuggling is entirely manufactured by the border policies themselves, but acknowledging that reality ruins the state's heroic narrative. So the campaigns focus all the blame entirely on the smuggler.
Makes sense.
And conversely, to make this narrative work, the state has to heavily manipulate how it depicts the migrant.
Yeah, the migrant is almost always stripped of their context as a legitimate asylum seeker. They're depicted as entirely ignorant, impulsive, or even immoral for attempting the journey.
Very sure.
For instance, Australia ran a massive campaign in Indonesia called Aku Tau. This campaign heavily utilized religious framing, strongly implying to the local population that people smuggling and unauthorized migration wasn't just illegal, it was literally a sin.
They are actively blending man-made administrative immigration law with divine law. It is a calculated attempt to manipulate the audience's deep-seated moral and religious compass.
And if you thought the religious guilt was manipulative, it gets so much stranger. We mentioned it at the very beginning of this deep dive, but we need to look closely at the Australian Department of Home Affairs and their astrology campaign.
Oh yes, the horoscope.
They actually created and distributed fake horoscopes, specifically targeting citizens in Sri Lanka to discourage boat travel.
When you look at the actual text of these state-sponsored horoscopes, the psychological manipulation is just staggering. What exactly were they predicting again?
Okay, so if you were a Sagittarius, the official Australian government horoscope told you you will be in debt forever. Everything you risk to get there will be in vain, and you will end up owing everyone.
Wow.
If you happen to be a Virgo, the stars supposedly said, going through with this illegal act will bring you nothing but bad luck. For a Pisces, the prediction was, you will lose your family's land, wasted right before your eyes.
Unbelievable.
They identified deeply held cultural beliefs in astrology and literally weaponized them to induce financial and familial terror.
It is a remarkable display of state paternalism. The underlying assumption behind distributing a fake horoscope or, programming an arcade game about a demonic sun is that the target audience is inherently irrational.
Right.
That they are hopelessly superstitious and completely incapable of making complex, informed decisions about their own survival. It reduces a nuanced life or death human rights crisis into a cartoonish fable.
So we've walked through the physical wall, the naval ships towing boats, the harrowing conditions of the remote island prisons, and we've unpacked the psychological wall, the multi-million-dollar ad campaigns, the fake horoscopes, the werewolf coyotes.
Yeah.
This brings us to the multi-billion-dollar question of this entire deep dive. After deploying all of this money, manpower, and creative energy, does any of this deterrence machinery actually work?
That is the ultimate question. Do these policies achieve their stated goal of stopping migration? And the hard empirical data gives us a very clear, resounding answer.
Though before we hit the numbers, it's worth noting they are still actively trying this approach.
They are.
The materials highlight a recent ongoing initiative in Sri Lanka called the Zero Chance Art and Essay Competition. The Australian government is literally enlisting school students, some as young as 9 years old, to create anti-migration artwork and write essays.
Yeah.
To organically deter their own communities from within.
They are attempting to infiltrate the culture at the ground level, basically turning children into vehicles for state messaging.
Right.
But if we look at the comprehensive data compiled by the Kaldor Centre for International Refugee Law, the efficacy of these informational campaigns is virtually zero when it comes to actually changing the minds of desperate people.
The numbers are genuinely staggering. Despite the very real, heavily publicized threat of being sent to a miserable offshore processing center in Nauru, combined with the $50 million spent on no-way billboards across the globe, the boats did not stop.
No, they didn't.
The Kaldor report notes that between 2012 and 2013, over 24,000 people still arrived in Australia by boat. That wasn't a decrease, it was a massive surge.
And the researchers point out that this failure of messaging was entirely predictable.
How so?
Well, if a human being is fleeing state terror, systemic torture, or severe starvation, no billboard, no fake astrology reading, and no threat of an island detention center is ever going to be nasty enough to stop them from running.
That makes total sense.
Migrants are almost always fully aware of the risks ahead of them, but the danger pushing them from behind is simply greater than the danger ahead.
Let me make sure I'm fully processing this scale. A government spends tens of millions on ad campaigns. They spend massive amounts of capital maintaining offshore detention centers. But 24,000 people still got on boats anyway? The data suggests the only thing that actually stopped the physical arrival of boats was when the military was deployed to physically intercept and tow them back out to sea. The psychological wall did nothing. This seems like an incredibly expensive illusion of control.
Expensive illusion is the perfect way to frame it. Let's look closely at the financial costs detailed in the government records. The Australian taxpayer is footing an astronomical bill to maintain this model of deterrence.
Right.
Operating the offshore processing system in Nauru and Papua New Guinea cost roughly $1 billion per year on average.
$1 billion a year
Yes.
to maintain facilities that medical experts say cause profound psychological damage.
Yes, and it peaked at an incredible $1.49 billion in the 2017 to 2018 financial year alone.
Oh my God.
All of this capital is poured into a system that human rights experts, international legal scholars, medical professionals, and even former politicians have labeled as an abject humanitarian failure.
See, this is the part that just defies logic. If the psychological campaigns don't actually deter people from trying to leave, and the physical detention centers cost billions of dollars while violating international law, why do governments keep doing it?
It's a great question.
Like, why keep funding the terrifying billboards and the island prisons if the data proves they don't solve the root problem?
Because the true success of these campaigns isn't actually about stopping migrants at all. It is about domestic political theater.
Theater.
Yes. The academic thesis we reviewed cites the political theorist Noam Chomsky, specifically his concept of manufacturing consent.
I've heard that phrase, but how does manufacturing consent apply to border control? What exactly is the government manufacturing consent for?
They are manufacturing the domestic public's consent for the existence of the massive border apparatus itself.
Oh.
Think about the psychological mechanism at play. These dramatic ad campaigns, the tough-talking politicians, the videos of heavily armed ships, they are a theatrical performance. They perform an illusion of strict order, ironclad control, and national sovereignty.
So it's for the people at home.
Exactly. The primary audience for a $50 million no-way campaign isn't actually the desperate migrant in Honduras or Sri Lanka. The most important audience is the domestic taxpayer sitting at home watching the evening news.
That makes total sense. By constantly feeding the domestic public a narrative of a dangerous, surging invasion orchestrated by evil monster smugglers, the government triggers a psychological threat response in its own citizens.
Exactly. It legitimizes a highly militarized, deeply expensive response. If the public genuinely believes there is an existential crisis at their border driven by irrational actors, they will willingly consent to signing over $1.49 billion to private contractors to run island detention camps.
Right.
They will consent to military budgets for more drones, more ships, and more surveillance. The crisis narrative justifies the immense budget required to protect the voter, even if the methods are exceptionally cruel or technically illegal under international law.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? We have gone deep into the mechanics today. We've seen that the massive machinery of deterrence, from the billions spent on island detention centers and high-seas military interceptions to the millions poured into fake horoscopes, arcade games, and action movie-style billboards, is incredibly costly. We've learned it operates in a highly questionable legal gray area regarding international human rights. And crucially, the empirical data shows it largely fails its stated humanitarian goals of saving lives, often causing profound psychological and physical harm instead.
The synthesis of all these diverse sources points to a very clear, undeniable pattern. As a global citizen, it is absolutely vital to look past the simplistic, fear-mongering slogans on billboards.
Absolutely.
We have to critically examine the neat villain versus victim narratives presented by the state. When you see a government issuing dire warnings about a chaotic border crisis or spending millions of dollars to deter people, you have to ask yourself, did their own enforcement policies help manufacture the very danger of that crisis?
Right.
Are they genuinely trying to solve a humanitarian problem, or are they just managing the optics of a problem they helped create to secure their own funding?
It really changes how you consume information. You have to constantly ask who is really benefiting from the story being told and who is profiting from the billion-dollar contracts.
It does require a critical eye. And I want to leave you with a final thought to chew on, something that builds on everything we've unpacked today.
Okay.
We have seen the immense, almost unfathomable resources deployed here. The billions of dollars handed over year after year to maintain island detention camps. The incredible creative energy, research, and manpower poured into writing culturally specific fake horoscopes or programming video games about demonic suns.
Yeah, it's a massive mobilization of money, technology, and human effort entirely dedicated to building walls.
Now imagine a different scenario. Imagine if nations took those exact same resources, that same $1 billion a year, that same intense logistical focus, that same creative energy, and instead invested it into creating safe, highly efficient legal pathways for migration. Or what if they invested that capital directly into addressing the regional instability, climate issues, or violence in the countries people are so desperately fleeing? If we stopped funding the expensive illusion of a wall and instead started funding the infrastructure of a door, would the concept of a border crisis even exist in the way we understand it today?
That is a powerful question to end on. A total paradigm shift in how we view global movement and resource allocation. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the looking glass of global border management. See you again in the next episode of this podcast.